Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on canal finance, factory discipline, and the market revolution. The core question is this: who benefits when canals, mills, and credit turn local households into parts of a national market? The core competency is to discuss major economic developments, including the expansion of industry and the effects of urbanization. Who benefits when canals, mills, and credit turn local households into parts of a national market? In the early 19th century, Americans moved through a large change in how work, travel, and exchange operated. Roads improved, canals were dug, steamboats moved upriver traffic more effectively, textile mills multiplied, and cities absorbed more workers and migrants. The phrase market revolution names that shift, but the phrase can sound cleaner than the process actually was. Households that had once sold mainly nearby now sold into wider markets. Merchants handled larger volumes. Farmers watched distant prices press harder on household decisions. Young workers entered wage labor under factory rules. Growth did not arrive as an abstract blessing. It arrived through toll schedules, credit arrangements, work bells, and transport networks. Before these changes accelerated, many families still relied heavily on local exchange and seasonal rhythms. Distance restrained commerce. Muddy roads, slow wagon travel, and limited river connections made it expensive to move bulky goods. A farmer's world could remain tied to a county or river valley because getting produce farther away cost too much. Market change altered that math. As transport improved, local production entered regional and national circulation. The same improvement that opened opportunity also made households more dependent on prices and decisions formed elsewhere. This shift touched time itself. A household economy could still follow daylight, weather, and season. A transport or factory economy required tighter schedules. Canal boats followed timetables. Warehouses tracked arrival and departure. Mill owners counted shifts and output. Clerks managed orders, invoices, and accounts. The new economy required coordination over distance, and coordination required measurement. Americans did not stop living by nature, but more of them had to live by the clock, the contract, and the deadline. The Erie Canal stands near the center of this transformation. New York began construction in 1817 and opened the canal in 1825. Stretching from Albany to Buffalo, it linked the Great Lakes interior to the Hudson River and then to New York City. The canal was a public works project on a massive scale for its time. Surveyors marked routes. Engineers designed locks and embankments. Laborers cut through forests and earth. State officials financed the work through bonds and expected toll revenues and increased commerce to justify the expense. The canal lowered freight costs dramatically. Western grain, flour, pork, and other goods moved east more cheaply. Manufactured goods moved west more efficiently. New York City strengthened its place as a major commercial center. State action drove the project. The canal did not emerge from individual enterprise alone. Legislators authorized it. Officials borrowed money. Engineers and contractors coordinated work. The project showed how government could redirect trade patterns. Towns along the route grew. Warehouses, docks, taverns, and service trades expanded. Land values changed. The canal also encouraged copycat infrastructure projects in other states, though many later canal ventures proved costlier and less successful than boosters hoped. At the same time, cotton remade the southern economy and tied it more closely to northern and Atlantic commerce. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, patented in 1794, made it easier to process short staple cotton by separating seeds from fiber much faster than hand labor alone. That machine did not reduce slavery. It increased the profitability of enslaved labor across the Deep South. Planters moved into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and later eastern Texas. Cotton bales fed textile mills in New England and Britain. Banks extended credit. Factors handled shipping and sale. Insurance firms covered cargo. Northern merchants profited from the trade, even when they did not own plantations themselves. The result was a linked economy rather than two separate stories. Canals moved grain and goods. Mills transformed cotton into cloth. Plantations drove raw material output through enslaved labor. Ports handled exports and imports. Credit connected all of them. A family in Western New York, a Lowell investor, a Mississippi planter, and a Liverpool textile buyer could be drawn into the same chain even though they lived in different social worlds. The market revolution widened movement, but it also tightened interdependence. The Lowell Mills in Massachusetts offer a clear example of industrial organization. Investors built textile mills powered by water from the Merrimack River. Recruiters brought in young women, many from New England farm families, to work the machines. The labor system combined wages, supervision, and boarding house life. Employers promoted the arrangement as respectable. Boarding house matrons monitored conduct. Bells regulated waking, meals, and work. Rules governed curfews, church attendance, and behavior. The system offered wages and some independence from farm households, yet it also imposed discipline at nearly every hour of the day. Factory labor differed from household labor in important ways. In a household workshop or farm setting, tasks might still vary with weather, season, and family need. In a mill, machinery set the pace. Supervisors tracked attendance. Late arrival could be punished. Noise, lint, heat, and fatigue shaped the workday. Girls and women in Lowell wrote letters and published pieces in the Lowell Offering, and some described opportunity, education, and companionship. Others protested wage cuts and longer hours. In the 1830s and 1840s, workers organized turnouts against reductions in pay and worsening conditions. Their protests showed that wage labor created new forms of dependence and new forms of resistance. Urbanization followed these industrial changes. Cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and smaller manufacturing centers grew through immigration, commerce, and wage work. Artisans faced pressure from cheaper manufactured goods. Some became wage earners rather than independent producers. Dock workers, clerks, domestic servants, seamstresses, and factory hands filled expanding labor markets. Rents pressed harder, cash wages pressed harder. Hard times in one sector could ripple outward. Workers could not always retreat to subsistence when prices fell or jobs vanished. Transportation workers and canal laborers also carried the market system on their backs. Irish immigrants dug canals, laid track, and performed heavy labor in dangerous conditions. Teamsters, steamboat crews, dockhands, and warehouse workers made distribution possible. Their names appear less often in celebratory accounts than those of inventors and financiers, but the system depended on them. A canal needed lock tenders, repair crews, and toll collectors. A railroad needed graders, ties, iron, and maintenance. A city market needed cartmen, weighers, and porters. The market revolution was physical before it was theoretical. Credit and debt intensified the pressure. Farmers borrowed to buy land and equipment, merchants borrowed to stock goods, state governments borrowed for canals and other improvements, banks issued notes and extended loans. When confidence held, expansion accelerated. When confidence failed, the pain spread quickly. The Panic of 1819 had already shown how credit contraction could devastate land buyers and debtors. Later booms and busts repeated the lesson. Market integration created opportunity, but it also transmitted failure farther and faster. Mechanization also changed older artisan trades. A shoemaker or weaver who once expected to control pace, tools, and product might now work inside a shop organized by someone else's capital. Piece rates, subcontracting, and larger workshops cut into older assumptions about independence. Printers, carpenters, and other skilled workers still existed, but many could feel the line moving between mastery and wage dependence. Cities became places where that line shaped daily life. A worker's freedom could now depend on whether he owned tools and shop space or only sold labor by the day. Steamboats expanded the transport picture farther. Robert Fulton's successful steamboat on the Hudson in 1807 helped demonstrate what steam power could do for inland navigation. Steamboats later moved heavily on the Mississippi and Ohio river systems, carrying freight, passengers, and mail. Western farmers gained more reliable routes to market. River towns grew as transfer points. Boilers exploded, crews labored under difficult conditions, and schedules tightened. The same machine that widened commerce also intensified danger and pace. The Declaration of Sentiments, issued at Seneca Falls in 1848, hit a public world already changed by the market revolution's social and commercial pressure. The Declaration is famous for women's rights claims, yet it also belongs to the wider story of economic and associational transformation. Women who worked for wages, read reform newspapers, attended lectures, circulated petitions, and moved through church and reform networks stood in a different public environment than women confined more completely to isolated household worlds. The Declaration came out of that changed environment. The Declaration lists grievances connected to law, marriage, property, education, work, and representation. One of its strongest lines states that married women were, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. That language points toward legal structure rather than sentiment. Married women in many states faced limits on property control, contract power, earnings, and public standing. Those restrictions became harder to defend in a society that increasingly required literacy, accounting, wage labor, public communication, and reform participation. The market revolution did not create women's rights automatically, but it created a broader setting in which the contradiction became more visible. The Declaration also shows the print culture of the era. A convention declaration was written to circulate. Newspapers could reprint it, critics could ridicule it, supporters could quote it, reformers could carry it into later meetings. That capacity for circulation depended on the same expanding communication world that carried prices, advertisements, and commercial notices. The machinery that spread goods also spread argument. Reading the Declaration beside canals, mills, and cotton shows that economic development rearranged social authority. A mill operative who earned wages occupied a different position from a daughter who never entered paid work. A woman writing for a reform publication had different tools from one without access to print networks. At the same time, industrial and commercial growth did not dissolve legal dependency. The Declaration records pressure inside the new economy. Production and transport expanded, but public rights did not widen at the same speed for everyone. The Declaration also belongs to a world shaped by rising literacy, larger newspaper circulation, and faster postal exchange. Those conditions did not create equal rights by themselves, but they made grievance easier to publish and harder to contain. A statement read in Seneca Falls could be debated in Albany, Boston, or Philadelphia. Within days or weeks, that circulation resembled market circulation. Distribution routes carried both cloth and claims. The market revolution raised output, lowered some transport costs, widened commerce, and accelerated urban growth. It also made more Americans dependent on impersonal systems. A canal toll, a bank loan, a cotton price, a mill bell, or a shipping delay could shape a household's fate. That dependence did not eliminate opportunity. It changed the terms on which opportunity was pursued. Northern industry and Southern slavery became more tightly connected. Mills needed raw cotton. Planters needed buyers, credit shippers, and insurers. Western farmers sold food into growing urban and industrial markets. State governments promoted improvements. Private investors chased returns. The economy became more integrated, and that integration made moral and political contradictions harder to isolate. Industrial progress in one region could rest on coerced labor in another. The period also produced a new politics of labor and reform. Wage earners protested cuts in hours. Women workers tested the boundaries of respectability and independence. Reformers used print and association to respond to conditions created by growth. The market revolution therefore belongs to both economic and civic history. It remade the material world and then forced Americans to argue about what those changes meant. Boom and bust cycles remained part of the story. The same credit networks that accelerated development also spread panic. Transportation improvements could enrich one region and burden another with debt. State-backed projects could succeed, like the Erie Canal, or fail and leave taxpayers exposed. The economy no longer depended only on the nearest harvest or merchant. It depended on systems that stretched beyond local sight. The record from canals, mills, cities, and cotton fields shows one connected transformation. Americans moved faster, produced more, bought and sold more widely, and measured time more strictly. They also faced stronger discipline from employers, lenders, and markets. The period can be understood accurately only if movement and dependence stay in the frame together. By the 1840s, railroads began joining canals and rivers as part of the transport system. Track mileage remained smaller than it would later become, but the direction was clear. Americans were building a national economy through overlapping infrastructures. Canals connected interior water routes. Steamboats linked river systems. Railroads promised year-round speed, less dependent on waterways. Each improvement required charters, investment, labor, and maintenance. Each one changed what counted as near and far. The market revolution, therefore, should be remembered as an accumulation of working systems rather than a single invention or date. The new economy altered distance, work rhythms, credit, and gender expectations without distributing control evenly. The harder judgment is whether infrastructure and market growth widened opportunity more than they widened dependency and discipline. That choice sits inside every toll schedule, wage table, and factory bell the period created.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.